There is something in the deep water that humanity has never been able to leave alone. Not the storms, not the distance, not the cold or the dark, or the thousand ordinary violences that the ocean delivers to anyone foolish enough to cross it without permission. Those things are dangerous, certainly. Those things have taken ships and sailors and entire fleets since the first human being looked at the sea and decided, against every reasonable instinct, to go out into it. But there is something else, something older than the storms, in the way that nightmares are older than the things that cause them, something that lives in the part of the human imagination that was never entirely comfortable with the idea that water goes down and down and down into a darkness so complete and so ancient that it predates every creature we have ever named and catalogued and understood. Something very large, something patient, something that, for as long as sailors have been putting words to the things they fear most, has been waiting beneath the surface with a stillness that only the truly enormous can maintain. They call it the Kraken. The word itself comes from the Old Norse, from the seafaring people of Scandinavia who knew the North Atlantic better than any other civilization of their age, and who had organized their understanding of its dangers into a mythology as precise and as practical as a nautical chart. Kraken. An unhealthy animal. A twisted thing. A creature so far outside the ordinary categories of living beings that even the language reaching for it seemed to bend. Norwegian fishermen used the word, the way other people use silence, to indicate something that resisted ordinary description and that you approached, even verbally, with a certain careful respect. It appeared in the written record with a definitiveness that is striking for a creature that has never, in any confirmed account, been measured or catalogued or touched by living human hands. The 12th century King's Mirror, a Norwegian educational text, a serious document, the kind of thing composed not for entertainment, but for instruction, described it plainly. A massive creature, vast beyond easy comprehension, dwelling in the cold waters off the coasts of Greenland and Iceland. Sailors who encountered it were not killed by its aggression necessarily, but by its size, by the displacement of water as it submerged, by the whirlpool it left behind when it descended, a vortex deep and powerful enough to swallow a ship as casually as a drain swallows a drop of water. The document treated it as an established fact of the natural world, not a legend, not a warning, a fact. And that detail matters. That is the thread we will follow throughout this documentary, because the Kraken does not behave like other monsters. It does not behave like the dragons of medieval Europe, confined to mountain keeps and the pages of illuminated manuscripts, products of a fear that was always more theological than practical. The Kraken was reported by practical people, by fishermen and sea captains and naturalists, by people whose lives and livelihoods depended on an accurate understanding of what the ocean contained. When these people wrote about the Kraken, they did not write about it with the heightened language of myth. They wrote about it with the measured, frustrated tone of professionals, trying to describe something that fell outside their available vocabulary. In 1752, the Bishop of Bergen, a man named Erik Pontoppidan, a natural historian of genuine scholarly standing, published his Natural History of Norway and devoted considerable space to the Kraken. He described it as the largest creature on Earth, approximately 1.5 miles in circumference. He described its method of feeding, rising slowly from the depth, spreading arms across the surface of the water so vast that they were mistaken for a chain of small islands, luring fish into the abundance of nutrients that surrounded its body, and then descending, taking everything above it down into the deep. Pontoppidan was not a credulous man. He was not writing folklore. He was attempting to produce a scientific account of a creature that he was entirely convinced existed, based on the testimonies of sailors whose reliability he had no particular reason to doubt. Here is the question that has haunted the Kraken across every century it has occupied. What if they were right? Not entirely right, not the 1.5 mile figure, not the island-sized body, not the whirlpool vast enough to drag a fleet to the bottom of the world, but essentially right. What if beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, in the permanent darkness of the deep ocean where pressure builds to figures that would crush a human body in seconds, and where light has not reached since the planet was young? What if something lives there that the human mind has been trying to describe since the first Viking ship was lost, without explanation on a calm, clear day? We know now that something does. We know what it is. We know its arms, its eyes, its biology, its reach, its considerable and genuinely staggering capacity for violence. We know with a precision that the Norse fishermen could not have imagined exactly how large it grows, and exactly what it is capable of doing to anything unlucky enough to encounter it in its own territory. And we know that the truth, as is so often the case with the things humanity fears most, is both less dramatic than the legend and considerably more astonishing. This is the story of the Kraken. We're going to start at the bottom of the ocean, in the dark, and work our way up toward the light. Try to stay calm. Part 1. Where monsters come from. Before we can understand what the Kraken is, we need to understand something more fundamental. We need to understand why it exists at all. Not in the biological sense. That answer is coming, and it is more satisfying than most people expect. But in the deeper sense, the human sense, the sense that asks, why does this particular creature, this specific shape of fear, appear in the records of so many different civilizations across so many different centuries, described in enough consistent detail that the consistency itself becomes a kind of evidence? Why did the Norse write about it? Why did the ancient Greeks circle the same terror from a different direction? Why did 18th century naturalists, men of the Enlightenment, men who had organized their intellectual lives around the rejection of superstition, still find themselves unable to entirely dismiss it? The answer, as with most things that have survived this long, is that the Kraken was never purely invention. Legends do not emerge from nothing. This is one of the most reliable principles in the study of mythology, and it is one that scholars have returned to again and again across every culture that has produced stories large enough to outlast the people who first told them. The details drift. The scale inflates. The creature that was terrifying and real becomes, through generations of retelling, something terrifying and impossible, something so far beyond the boundaries of the natural world that it slides from report into mythology without anyone noticing exactly when the transition occurred. But underneath the inflation, underneath the centuries of elaboration and exaggeration, there is almost always something that happened to somebody, something they saw, something they could not explain, something that required a name because unnamed things are, in their way, even more frightening than named ones. The Kraken required a very large name. The oldest roots of the legend reach back further than the Norse, further even than the written record of the Mediterranean world, to the place where all maritime mythology begins, the moment the first human being looked at the open ocean and understood, with a certainty that no amount of courage could entirely dissolve, that the water was not empty. The ancient Greeks had Scylla, the multi-headed monster of the Strait of Messina, positioned by Homer in the Odyssey between the rock and the whirlpool, taking sailors with multiple arms from a ship that could not stop moving. She is not the Kraken, exactly. She is something adjacent to it, something occupying the same imaginative territory. A creature of enormous reach, of multiple grasping appendages, of a hunger so permanent and so vast that it required no provocation beyond proximity. Homer described her as possessing 12 legs and 6 heads on long necks, each head full of triple rows of teeth, each always reaching. The sailors who passed her could do nothing but sail and watch and count how many of them were taken, and the number was always 6, because Scylla was as precise in her devastation as she was inevitable. You did not fight Scylla. You calculated how many men you were willing to lose, and you kept moving. The parallel to the Kraken is not accidental, and it is not coincidental. It is the same fear dressed in different clothes, generated by different waters, given different details by different people who had nevertheless arrived at the same fundamental conclusion, that the sea has arms, and the arms reach up, and there is a size of creature against which human resistance is simply not a meaningful category. Further east, in the traditions of the ancient Near East, the sea monster Leviathan occupied similar territory, a creature of such scale and such power that the Book of Job describes it as something only God could subdue, a beast that made the deep water boil like a pot, whose breath set coals ablaze, whose chest was as hard as a lower millstone. The Leviathan was not described as having arms in the way the Kraken has arms, but it was described as vast beyond measurement, as dwelling in the deepest water, as something that had existed since before human civilization began, and that would exist after it ended. Something permanent, something indifferent, something that the ocean kept at its deepest level, the way a treasury keeps its most significant contents, not hidden exactly, but not easily reached. These traditions were not communicating with each other. The Norse fishermen writing about the Kraken in the 12th century had not read Homer's account of Scylla. The authors of Job were not consulting Scandinavian nautical records. What they shared was the ocean itself, the same darkness, the same depth, the same returning suspicion that the surface of the water was not the whole story, and that what lay beneath it had not been fully accounted for. Independent cultures, arriving independently at the same shape of fear, is not evidence of shared mythology. It is evidence of shared experience. Something in the ocean was generating this. The Norse accounts are where the Kraken becomes most specific, most detailed, and most useful to anyone trying to trace the creature from legend back toward reality. The geography matters enormously here, and it is the first place where the legend and the natural history begin to converge in ways that are difficult to dismiss. The Kraken was not reported everywhere. It was not a universal sea monster, appearing with equal frequency in the trade routes of the Mediterranean and the warm waters of the Indian Ocean and the fishing grounds of the South Pacific. It was reported consistently, persistently, and with considerable specificity in the cold, deep waters of the North Atlantic, in the seas off Norway, off Iceland, off Greenland. It had an address. Monsters of pure imagination rarely have addresses. They appear wherever the story needs them. The Kraken appeared where the water was coldest and deepest and most difficult to see into, and it did not appear anywhere else with anything like the same regularity. In 1180, the Norwegian text known as Konungs Skuggsjar, the King's Mirror, described the Kraken with the precision of a naturalist rather than a storyteller. It was one of 3 enormous creatures said to inhabit the seas around Greenland, and it was distinguished from the others by its size, which the text stated was simply beyond the capacity of any comparison to adequately convey. When it fed, it rose toward the surface, not breaking it dramatically, not announcing itself with the theatrical violence of a story's monster, but rising slowly, enormously, disturbing the water in ways that were felt before they were seen. Fish gathered above it, drawn by the nutrient-rich water its body displaced. Fishermen, who found themselves in the middle of an inexplicably abundant catch, were advised to pay close attention to the depth beneath them, because an abundance that came from nowhere was sometimes the last abundance you would ever find. The creature, when it sank again, created a displacement so severe that the water above it collapsed into the space where it had been, producing the whirlpool that appears in every account, the rotating column of descending water that was the Kraken's most consistent and most fatal signature. This detail, the whirlpool, is not the invention of a storyteller reaching for drama. It is a hydrodynamic consequence of an extremely large object moving through water. Displacement is not mythology. It is physics, and the question of what had to be moving through the water to produce the whirlpools that Norse sailors described, with a frequency that suggests repeated encounter rather than single incident, is a question that pulls us firmly out of the realm of folklore and into something considerably more interesting. The most famous single account of a Kraken encounter that sits on the border between recorded observation and honest uncertainty belongs to the year 1639 and to a Danish missionary named Hans Egede. Egede was traveling off the coast of Greenland, the same coastline that appears in almost every Kraken account, the same cold and uncooperative water, when his ship encountered something that he recorded in his journal with the careful, slightly bewildered tone of a man who has seen something he cannot organize into any existing category and has decided that accuracy is more important than appearing sane. The creature, he wrote, was of so huge a size that coming out of the water, its head reached as high as the masthead. Its body was bulky as the ship and 3 or 4 times as long. It had a long pointed snout and spouted like a whale, and broad, large flappers. It was not so much a description of a monster as it was a description of something biological, something with specific anatomical features, something that behaved according to observable patterns, something that was, in Egede's honest and frustrated assessment, simply too large to have a name he already knew. Then there is the account from 1873, off the coast of Newfoundland, where fishermen found a mass of something in the water and brought it aboard. And what they brought aboard turned out to have arms, very long arms. Arms that attached to a body of considerable size, a beak, and eyes that the fishermen later described as being approximately the size of dinner plates. This was not a story. It was a specimen. It was photographed. It was brought to a museum. It was examined by naturalists who had spent their careers skeptical of the Kraken and who found themselves looking at the thing on the examination table, running out of skepticism rather quickly. It was a giant squid. And here is where the Kraken legend stops being a legend and becomes something considerably more verifiable, considerably more strange, and if you are the kind of person who finds the truth of things more compelling than the mythology of them, considerably more unsettling, because the giant squid is real, demonstrably, measurably, photographically real. It lives in the deep ocean. It lives specifically in the cold, dark, nutrient-rich waters of the North Atlantic, but the Norse identified as Kraken territory 1200 years ago. It has arms, 10 of them, 2 longer than the rest, lined with suckers that bear sharp, rotating teeth, capable of cutting through flesh with a precision that leaves circular scars on the skin of sperm whales, scars found on nearly every adult sperm whale ever examined, scars that tell a story about what happens in the permanent darkness of the deep ocean between the 2 largest predators on Earth. And we do not know how large it grows. We know how large the ones we have found are. We know the measurements of the specimens that have washed ashore, been dragged up in nets, been glimpsed by the cameras of deep-sea research vessels in footage so rare and so strange that scientists who watched it for the first time reportedly sat in silence for several seconds before speaking. The largest confirmed specimen measured approximately 45 feet from the tip of its mantle to the end of its longest tentacles. 45 feet of cold-blooded, ink-producing, chromatophore, shifting, beak-bearing, dinner-plate-eyed animal that no human being had ever photographed alive in its natural habitat until 2004. But the ocean is very deep, and the giant squid is very good at staying in it, and the sperm whales that hunt it, animals that dive deeper than almost any other mammal on Earth, that can hold their breath for 90 minutes and descend to depths of 7,000 feet in pursuit of prey. Those whales carry scars from arms considerably larger than any arm we have ever measured. The math implied by those scars points toward a creature beyond anything in our specimen record. beyond anything in our catalogue, beyond anything, if we are being precise about it, that we have confirmed with our own instruments and our own eyes. The Norse had a word for it. They arrived at that word not through imagination, but through encounter, through the cold, specific, repeatable experience of men who worked the same water every season of their lives, and who knew the difference between a wave and something that was not a wave. They called it Kraken, and the ocean, which has been keeping its most significant contents at depth since long before the first human being was capable of being frightened by them, has not yet shown us everything. It is patient in that way. It has always been patient in that way. Part 2. The shape of the thing. Not a problem of vocabulary or imagination, or the limits of language reaching for something that resists easy articulation. A practical problem, a problem that naturalists and sailors and deep-sea researchers have all encountered independently and arrived at the same frustrated conclusion about. The Kraken, in its truest and most complete form, has almost never been seen all at once. What has been seen are pieces of it, an arm here, a tentacle there, the suggestion of a body beneath the surface, glimpsed through dark water in conditions that were rarely ideal and never comfortable. The aftermath of its presence, the churned water, the displaced fish, the circular scars left on the bodies of animals large enough to have survived the encounter. The Kraken has left evidence of itself across centuries and across oceans, the way a very large and very unconcerned animal leaves evidence, not deliberately, not as communication, but simply as the unavoidable consequence of being that large in a world where smaller things are always watching, and what that evidence, assembled carefully across 1,200 years of human record-keeping, actually looks like. What picture emerges when you lay all of it together in the same light and look at it without flinching, is simultaneously more recognizable and more disturbing than the mythology prepared you for. Begin with the body, because the body is where the Kraken departs most sharply from the monsters that preceded it in the human imagination. The great sea monsters of ancient mythology were, almost universally, designed along familiar biological lines. Scylla had heads, recognizable, mammalian, biting heads on recognizable necks. Leviathan was scaled, serpentine, built from the same template as the largest land predators the ancient world had encountered, and simply scaled upward until it filled the ocean. The sea serpents of medieval cartography, those coiling, fanged creatures that decorators placed in the blank spaces of maps where the known world ran out, were essentially enormous snakes, which is to say, they were enormous versions of something the human eye already knew how to process. They were frightening because of their size and their teeth and their hunger. They were not frightening because they were strange. The Kraken is different in kind, not just in degree. What the Kraken actually looks like, what the giant squid actually looks like, in the cold and reluctant footage that deep-sea cameras have finally managed to capture, is something that the human visual system does not process with the comfortable efficiency it reserves for things it recognizes. It is not a large version of something familiar. It is a fundamentally alien architecture of living tissue, organized according to principles that evolution arrived at independently of everything that walks or runs or breathes air on the surface of this planet. The mantle, the main body, the torpedo-shaped central mass that houses the organs, is muscular and smooth, capable of changing color with a speed and precision that still strikes researchers as genuinely unsettling, even after years of study. Chromatophores, pigment cells embedded in the skin, each one individually controllable, allowing the animal to produce patterns of color and light and texture across its entire body surface in real time. The giant squid uses this ability in the deep ocean, in water where almost no light penetrates, for reasons that we have not fully catalogued, and that we observe, when we observe them at all, with the specific uncertainty of watching something communicate in a language we do not speak and cannot yet translate. From the mantle extend the arms, 8 of them, thick and powerful and lined along their inner surfaces with suckers that are not the gentle, suction cup attachments of a bathroom tile. They are weapons. Each sucker on the longer tentacles is ringed with a serrated edge of chitin, a hard, claw-like material that rotates under pressure, designed not merely to grip, but to cut. When a giant squid takes hold of something, the hold is not passive. It is active, self-tightening, and destructive in the specific way that a trap with teeth is destructive. The circular scars found on sperm whales, those rings of scar tissue arranged in patterns across the whale's head and flanks, are the permanent record of what those suckers do when the animal applying them is not inclined to let go. Then there are the 2 tentacles, longer than the arms, retractable, tipped with flattened clubs that bear the largest and most heavily armed suckers on the entire animal. These are the reach. These are what closes the distance between the squid and whatever it has decided to eat, shooting outward with a speed that high-speed cameras have only recently been able to capture clearly, covering distances that would require a human arm to extend 12, 15, 20 feet in a fraction of a second. They make contact. The clubs adhere, the suckers cut, and whatever is at the end of those tentacles is pulled backward through the water toward the arms, which take over from there with the methodical, multi-limbed efficiency of something that has been perfecting this sequence for hundreds of millions of years. In the center of all of it, where the arms converge, the beak. This is the detail that tends to stop people when they encounter it for the first time, because the beak does not fit. It is the one part of the Kraken's anatomy that the human eye immediately categorizes. It recognizes a beak. It has seen beaks before, on birds, on turtles, on other animals, and the recognition makes the wrongness of its location more acute rather than less. A beak, hard and curved and capable of shearing through material that the surrounding soft tissue could never handle, positioned at the center of a ring of arms, on an animal that is otherwise nothing like anything that has a beak. It is powerful enough to cut through steel cable, powerful enough to sever the limbs of prey that the arms cannot tear. It is, by every measurement, the killing instrument of a creature that has been designed by millions of years of deep ocean selection pressure to be exactly as lethal as it needs to be in an environment where lethal is the baseline requirement for survival. And above all of it, above the arms and the beak and the color-shifting skin and the torpedo body, the eyes. The eyes of the giant squid are the largest eyes of any living animal on Earth. Let that settle for a moment, because it is the kind of fact that sounds like the beginning of an exaggeration and is instead the beginning of a biological argument that has occupied researchers for years. The largest confirmed giant squid eyes measured approximately 11 inches in diameter. 11 inches, the size of a large dinner plate, larger than a human head if you remove the skull, larger than the eyes of any other creature alive, or, as far as the fossil record tells us, any creature that has ever lived, larger even than those of the blue whale, which is the largest animal on the planet by every other measurement, and which does not have eyes remotely approaching this scale relative to its body. Why does the giant squid need eyes that large? The answer is both scientifically precise and, if you sit with it long enough, quietly terrifying. The giant squid lives at depths where light essentially does not exist. The surface light of the sun, which drives almost every biological process on the planet above the thermocline, does not reach the depths where the Kraken dwells in any meaningful quantity. At 600 meters, The ocean is dark. At 1,000 meters, it is darker than dark. It is the specific, total, sensory-erasing darkness of a place that the universe did not design for things that need to see. And yet the giant squid needs to see. Specifically, it needs to see sperm whales, the one predator on Earth, large and determined and deep-diving enough to hunt it, in time to do something about them. Sperm whales are bioluminescent in certain ways, and they disturb the bioluminescent plankton around them as they move, producing a faint ghost of light in the darkness that announces their approach to anything capable of detecting it. The giant squid's extraordinary eyes are calibrated specifically for this light, for the faint, cold, scattered blue luminescence that a descending sperm whale produces at depth. Those enormous pupils, wider than any other animal's, capable of collecting every available photon in water that has no photons to spare, are watching for the one shape that means danger in the permanent dark. They're watching upward, mostly, toward the surface, toward where the light comes from and where the whales descend from, which means that when a giant squid's eyes are pointed at something, when that dinner plate gaze has found its focus, whatever it is looking at is being assessed by the most sophisticated low-light optical system that evolution has produced in 500 million years of trying. Compare all of this for a moment to the other great monsters of the sea, the great white shark, the creature that occupies more of the human fear response than perhaps any other animal alive, is a predator of genuine and considerable capability. It is fast. It is precise. It detects blood in concentrations of 1 part per million. Its bite force is measured in tons. It is, by every meaningful metric, an extraordinarily dangerous animal, and the fear it generates is entirely reasonable. But the great white shark is also visible. It exists near the surface. It has been filmed, studied, measured, tagged, and understood with a completeness that, while not total, at least provides the comfort of the known. You can see a great white shark coming. You can, in theory, respond. The encounter, however dangerous, occurs on terms that include your awareness of it. The sperm whale, the only animal on Earth that hunts the giant squid by choice and survives the experience, is larger than the Kraken by most estimates, longer, heavier, possessed of a biosonar system capable of stunning prey with focused sound, and a jaw capable of producing bite forces that make the great white look restrained. It is one of the most formidable predators in the ocean, and it carries, on its skin, the circular evidence of every giant squid that decided not to be eaten without a fight. Those scars are the great white shark comparison that most people miss. The great white leaves scars on the things it attacks. So does the Kraken. The difference is that the great white scars are on prey. The Kraken scars are on the animal that hunts it. There is something in that inversion worth sitting with. But here is the thing. Here is the part of the Kraken's appearance that the footage and the specimens and the careful anatomical descriptions have not fully prepared anyone for. The detail that separates it from every other large and dangerous animal in the ocean, and that explains why 1,200 years of sailors reached instinctively for the language of myth rather than the language of natural history. The Kraken does not look like a predator, not on the surface, not at first, not in the way that a shark looks like a predator, or a whale looks like a predator, or any surface-dwelling, air-breathing, sunlight-hunting animal looks like a predator. With the forward-facing eyes, and the speed lines, and the general arrangement of features that the human brain has been trained by millions of years of evolution to read as dangerous, the Kraken looks like nothing. It looks like a category that does not have a pre-existing slot in the human fear architecture. It looks like something that arrived at the same solutions as a predator by a completely different path, and the result is an animal that can examine you with eyes the size of dinner plates, while its arms drift in the current around it, like something that is simply waiting, simply present, simply occupying the same space you have entered without invitation. The scariest part of the Kraken is not its size, though the size is considerable. It is not the beak, though the beak would concern you greatly at close range. It is not the arms, or the tentacles, or the cutting suckers, or the alien biology of an animal that can change its own appearance in real time, in water that has no light. The scariest part of the Kraken is the eyes, because the eyes are looking, constantly, patiently in the dark, at depths no human body was built to reach, watching upward, watching for the shape of something descending. And the eyes do not care what is descending. The eyes simply watch and assess and communicate the assessment to a nervous system distributed across 10 arms and 2 tentacles and a body that evolution has had 500 million years to optimize for a single purpose. The scariest part of the Kraken is that when you go deep enough, something down there is already looking back. It has been looking back for a very long time. It is in no particular hurry. Part 3. What it could do. There is a thought experiment that naval historians rarely perform, because naval historians are, by professional temperament, people who prefer their variables to be measurable. They like tonnage and cannon range and wind speed, and the documented outcomes of engagements that actually occurred between vessels that actually existed. They are not, as a rule, in the business of calculating the combat capabilities of creatures that live at 1,000 meters of depth and have never formally engaged a warship. But the variables, it turns out, are not as immeasurable as they might appear. We have the biology, we have the physics, we have the historical record of what the ocean's most capable predators can and cannot do to structures built by human hands. And we have enough overlapping data between the Kraken's confirmed capabilities and the known weaknesses of the vessels that sailed the North Atlantic during the centuries of peak Kraken, reporting to produce something that is not quite speculation and not quite certainty, something in between, something that deserves to be taken seriously. So let us take it seriously. Begin with what the giant squid, the confirmed, measured, photographed animal that underlies the legend, is actually capable of doing in a direct physical confrontation. The arms of a large giant squid are not analogous to the arms of any land animal you have encountered. They are not the grasping limbs of something that evolved to climb or carry or manipulate objects at human scale. They are hydraulic, muscular structures of extraordinary strength, each one capable of exerting force that researchers have estimated based on the depth and geometry of the scars they leave on sperm whale tissue, in the range of several hundred pounds per square inch at the point of sucker contact. Not the total force, the force at each individual sucker, and a mature giant squid has hundreds of suckers distributed across 10 arms and 2 tentacles, each one capable of independent, simultaneous engagement. The mathematics of what that means for anything those arms take hold of is not comfortable mathematics. A sperm whale, an animal weighing between 35 and 57 metric tons, possessed of a jaw force capable of crushing almost anything its teeth can reach, carries scars from giant squid encounters that penetrate several centimeters into blubber that is itself several centimeters thick. The scars are not glancing. They are not the superficial marks of a creature defending itself ineffectively before being eaten. They are the marks of a sustained, determined, multi-point engagement in which the squid applied its full capability to an animal that was simultaneously trying to kill it, and the whale's skin remembers the contact permanently. Every adult sperm whale carries this record, every single one. That is what the arms do to something made of dense biological tissue with a fat layer specifically designed to absorb damage. Now consider what those arms would do to wood, the ships of the great age of sail, the vessels that crossed the North Atlantic during the period when Kraken reports were most frequent, roughly the 12th through the 18th centuries, were built from timber, oak primarily, in the vessels of northern Europe. Dense, carefully selected, seasoned oak planking. that was the finest boat-building material available to human craftsmen of that era, and that was capable of absorbing considerable punishment from the one thing those ships were actually designed to resist: cannon fire. Oak hull planking on a well-built vessel of the 16th or 17th century ran between 4 and 8 inches thick, with additional internal structural framing that could add considerably to the effective resistance at any given point. A ship's hull was not a single layer of wood. It was a composite structure of planking, frames, and internal bracing that distributed force across a wide area, and was genuinely difficult to compromise with any weapon available in that period. Against a cannonball traveling at several hundred feet per second, that hull held, usually, against a grinding, sustained, multi-point application of force from an animal with hundreds of independently operating grip points, each one applying several hundred pounds per square inch, and tipped with serrated chitin designed to cut rather than merely compress. The oak does not hold. This is not hyperbole. This is material science. The failure mode of wood under that kind of distributed, sustained, cutting pressure is not the clean breach of a cannonball impact. It is slower and more comprehensive than that. The fibers of the wood separate. The planking, which is designed to resist sudden compressive force, has no particular resistance to the slow, rotational, cutting engagement of a sucker that is simultaneously gripping and slicing. What would happen to the hull planking of a 16th century sailing vessel if a sufficiently large giant squid were to take hold of it and apply the same sustained grip force it applies to a sperm whale? Is, in the estimation of anyone who has studied both the biology and the materials, not a question of whether the wood would fail. It is a question of how quickly. And that is before we discuss what happens to the vessel above the waterline, a sailing ship's rigging. The network of ropes and lines and spars that constitutes its propulsion system is arguably more vulnerable than its hull. Hemp rope of the period, even heavily tarred against the weather, has tensile strength measured in the hundreds of pounds. A single arm from a mature giant squid, applied to a running line or a shroud, would part it. Applied to a spar, one of the horizontal timbers from which the sails hung, it would crack it. Applied to the mast itself, the central structural element around which the entire propulsion system of the ship was organized, it would, given sufficient leverage and sufficient applied force, work the mast at its partners and eventually compromise the step, the structural socket in the keel that held the mast upright. Without masts, a sailing ship is not a vessel. It is a box that is taking on water from the hull damage below. But here is where the comparison to other sea threats becomes genuinely important, because the Kraken is not simply a large and dangerous animal. It is a large and dangerous animal with a specific and consistent behavioral profile, and that profile tells us something crucial about how a confrontation with it would actually unfold. Sharks attack with speed. A great white shark's predatory engagement is explosive. A burst approach, a bite, a retreat to assess. The entire initial engagement is over in seconds. The danger is acute, sudden, and concentrated in a very small window of time. If you survive the first contact, the calculus changes immediately. Orcas attack with intelligence. They are social hunters that coordinate, that learn, that adapt their strategy to the specific prey animal they are pursuing. They are arguably the most sophisticated hunters in the ocean, and the danger they present is precisely their unpredictability. You cannot generalize an orca's approach because the orca is actively revising its approach in real time based on your responses. The Kraken attacks with patience and with reach. This is the crucial distinction. The giant squid does not need to close range to engage. Its two tentacles, the long, retractable, club-tipped weapons that extend well beyond the span of the arms, can cover distances of 15 to 20 feet in the fraction of a second it takes to complete an extension. The animal's body can remain at a distance that feels safe. The distance that feels safe is a fiction that the tentacles render immediately irrelevant. And once contact is made, once those club tips have adhered and the suckers have begun their work, the mechanics favor the squid absolutely. Because the squid is pulling inward, toward its own body, toward its arms, toward its beak, and pulling inward is precisely what every structure of its anatomy is designed to do. The prey is fighting not just the grip of the tentacles, but the entire accumulated pulling force of 10 arms working in coordination. Against a ship, those tentacles would find purchase on the rail, the bowsprit, the anchor chain, the rudder assembly, any protruding structure that offered a grip point, and once found, the pulling would begin. Now we must ask, has any vessel in history actually been suited to resist this? The honest answer is that no vessel designed for surface sailing was designed with this specific threat in mind, for the obvious reason that the people designing those vessels did not fully believe the threat was real. But if we examine the historical fleet types of the North Atlantic with the Kraken's capabilities in mind, we can identify which would have fared better than others, and the answer is instructive. The longships of the Norse, the vessels whose crews were reporting the Kraken most frequently during the medieval period, were, in a specific sense, the worst possible ship to encounter. 1. They were shallow-drafted, low-sided, open vessels with minimal freeboard and no enclosed hull structure above the waterline. Beautiful ships, extraordinary ships by the standards of their era, capable of speed and maneuverability that would not be surpassed for centuries, but low to the water, with all of their crew exposed on an open deck, with their sides within easy reach of anything in the water alongside them. A giant squid that surfaced beside a Viking longship would not need to reach upward. It would barely need to reach at all. The great carrack of the 15th century, the high-sided, heavy, multi-decked merchant vessel that was the workhorse of early Atlantic exploration, was considerably more resistant simply by virtue of its freeboard. Its sides rose well above the waterline, its structure was heavier and more internally braced than anything the Norse had built, and its sheer bulk meant that any attempt to displace it through pulling force alone would require a creature of truly extraordinary size. A carrack could not fight a Kraken, but it could survive a brief engagement by virtue of being too massive and too tall to be easily overcome, at least initially. The danger would come not from being capsized, but from having the rigging destroyed, from losing propulsion while the creature circled, unharmed, in the water below. The ship of the line, the great warships of the 17th and 18th centuries, with their multiple gun decks and their massively reinforced hulls, was the most structurally resistant vessel the age of sail produced, built to absorb the broadside fire of other ships of the line, which represented the most destructive concentrated force humans had yet learned to project at sea. These vessels had hull construction that was genuinely formidable by any material standard. Their sides were in places 2 feet of solid oak. Their internal framing was continuous and heavily bolted. They weighed, in the largest examples, several thousand tons. They also carried, crucially, guns. Lots of guns. And this is where the question of naval resistance to the Kraken stops being purely defensive and becomes something considerably more active. It is the guns that change the calculation. Not because cannon fire is the ideal anti-Kraken weapon. It is not, and we will explain precisely why. But because the presence of heavy ordnance introduces the possibility that a vessel under Kraken attack might be able to do something beyond endure. That it might be able to respond, that the engagement, in other words, might not be purely one-directional. A bronze cannon of the 17th century, firing a 12-pound shot, had an effective range of several hundred yards, and a muzzle velocity sufficient to penetrate several feet of oak at close range. Against biological tissue, against the mantle of a giant squid that had surfaced alongside a vessel. The penetrating power would be considerable, and the stopping effect would be real. Squid tissue is dense and muscular, but it is not armored. It does not have the structural redundancy of bone. A direct hit from a 12-pound shot on the main body of a giant squid would cause catastrophic damage to whatever internal structures it encountered. And the internal structures of a giant squid include organs that are not, to put it gently, arranged for resilience against sudden high-velocity impact. But here is the difficulty. A ship's cannon points outward, horizontally or nearly so, along the broadside. What it does not do easily, what the entire design of a period warship's gunnery system was not organized around, is point downward. And the Kraken, in any realistic engagement scenario, would not be beside the ship in a way that the broadside could conveniently address. It would be below the ship. Its body would be at depth, its arms extending upward to the surface, its tentacles reaching for whatever they could find. The target, the mantle, the body, the thing that needs to be hit to cause meaningful damage, would be underwater, below the waterline, inaccessible to guns that fire horizontally across the surface. You would be shooting at arms. Shooting at arms is not ineffective. An arm severed by cannon fire is an arm that is no longer pulling at your rigging or your hull. But the giant squid has 10 of them, plus 2 tentacles, and it has been operating in an environment that removes arms and tentacles with some regularity. Sperm whales do not leave the encounter undamaged either, and it continues functioning. It regenerates lost tissue. It adapts. Losing an arm to cannon fire is painful, presumably, and disorienting, possibly, but it is not terminal. It is not the kind of damage that ends the engagement. To end the engagement, you need to reach the body, and reaching the body in any realistic scenario requires going into the water, which brings us at last to the pirates. It is the summer of 1721, the North Atlantic, 4 days west of the Faroe Islands. The fleet, if 3 vessels can properly be called a fleet, and these 3 men have always called themselves whatever title most improves their standing, consists of the following. The Perdition's compass, a captured Dutch fluid of approximately 300 tons, heavily modified from its original merchant configuration with an additional gun deck cut into its sides, carrying 14 cannon of mixed caliber and a crew of 68 men under the command of a Welshman named Kraken, who has been operating in these waters for 11 years and who has survived everything the North Atlantic has put in front of him through a combination of genuine seamanship and a refusal to accept the conventional wisdom about what is survivable. Beside her, the Saint's Lament, a smaller brigantine of perhaps 180 tons, faster than the fluid by several knots in a good wind, carrying 8 guns and a crew of 31 under a Dutch captain named Horn, who lost 2 fingers to a cutlass in a boarding action off the Azores and has been making decisions with slightly less patience ever since. And at the rear, the Absolution, a converted fishing vessel of barely 120 tons, that has no business being in open ocean and knows it, carrying 4 guns of questionable reliability, and a crew of 22 whose primary qualification is that they were available. They are not here by choice precisely. They are here because the Faroe route has become, in recent months, one of the few passages in the North Atlantic where the naval presence of the major powers has not yet caught up with them. They have been moving north to avoid pursuit, which is a solution that creates its own category of problems, and they are 4 days from the nearest harbor they trust, in water that is cold and dark and deep enough that the bottom of the ocean is a meaningless abstraction, a distance so far below them that it might as well not exist. It is Karen's navigator who notices it first, not the creature itself. The effect of the creature. The water ahead of the Perdition's compass has a quality to it that is wrong, in a way that is difficult to name precisely, but impossible to ignore once noticed. The color is different, not the uniform gray-blue of the surface around them, but something darker, stained from below, a shadow in the water that has no corresponding shadow in the sky above it. The fish that have been following the ships for 2 days. The small, silver-sided Atlantic herring that trail vessels in these waters with the optimistic persistence of animals that have learned that ships mean scraps, are gone. Not gradually gone. Gone. As though the water they were occupying simply ceased to be a good place to be, simultaneously and without warning. The navigator tells Karen. Karen looks at the water ahead. He orders the helm to come about. He is not in time. What surfaces alongside the Perdition's compass does not surface dramatically. It does not breach the way a whale breaches, throwing its body into the air with the explosive energy of something that has crossed a threshold from one element to another. It rises, slowly, with the specific, unhurried enormity of something that does not have predators, and therefore has never learned to move as though it does. The mantle, the main body, the torpedo-shaped central mass, breaks the surface to a length that the men on deck will later describe in terms that range from 40 feet to 100, depending on who is speaking and how much time has passed, and how much of the memory has been processed into story. The arms follow. They do not thrash. They extend, one by one, with a patience that is more frightening than any sudden movement, spreading across the surface of the water in the way that the roots of an old tree spread across the ground, occupying space not aggressively but completely, as though the space was always theirs and the ship merely happened to be in it. 2 of them find the rail of the Perdition's compass. Karen has perhaps 45 seconds before the ship's situation becomes irretrievable. He knows this not because he has encountered this specific problem before. No one aboard any of these 3 vessels has encountered this specific problem before, but because he has spent 11 years reading situations and estimating windows, and the window here is not difficult to read. The arms are on his rail. The arms are pulling. The ship is already beginning to list to the port side, slowly, as the combined grip of 2 massive biological cables applies lateral force to a hull that was not designed to resist lateral force of this kind. He makes 4 decisions simultaneously, which is 1 more than most men can manage, and 3 more than some. The first, he orders every man on the port side, the side facing the creature, away from the rail and into the center of the ship, not because the creature is reaching for them specifically, but because the rail is going to fail, and the men standing at it when it fails are going into the water, and men in the water beside a giant squid are not men who come back. The second, he orders the cook fires extinguished and the tar pots brought up from storage. The barrels of pine tar that are part of any working ship's maintenance supplies, thick and viscous and, when heated, reliably combustible. He does not yet know exactly what he is going to do with the tar. He knows that fire is the only thing he has access to, that the creature cannot grip without consequence. The third, he sends a signal to the Saint's Lament. Horn, in the brigantine, has already seen what is happening and is closing, not because Horn has a plan, but because Horn's default response to any crisis has always been to get closer to it, which is a quality that has served him inconsistently, but which is, in this specific moment, the correct instinct. The fourth, he orders a gun crew to the 2 stern chasers. The cannons mounted at the rear of the ship, which can be swiveled to cover a wider arc than the broadside guns. And he tells them to load with chain shot, not bore, chain shot, 2 iron hemispheres connected by a length of chain, designed for use against rigging, designed specifically to cut through cordage and spars with a sweeping, rotating force rather than a concentrated point impact, against arms that are wrapped around his rail. Chain shot is not the ideal weapon, but it is the weapon most likely to sever rather than merely wound, and severing is what the next 30 seconds require. The chain shot fires. The first round cuts through the arm closest to the stern, not cleanly, not surgically, but enough. The arm recoils, not retreats. The creature does not retreat, but recoils, in the way that any large animal recoils from sudden, sharp, unexpected pain. It pulls back from the rail 6 inches, and those 6 inches are enough for the list to ease fractionally, for the deck to come closer to level, for the men in the center of the ship to stop sliding toward the port side. The second arm holds. Orn arrives with the Tsar's lament on the creature's opposite side. This is either brilliant or catastrophic, and for the first 20 seconds it is genuinely unclear which. Brilliant, because it divides the creature's attention, or whatever functional analog to attention a giant squid possesses, between two threats in two directions simultaneously. Catastrophic, because the Saint's Lament is 180 tons of converted merchant vessel with 8 guns, and it has just placed itself within arm's reach of something that has already demonstrated a willingness to take hold of a 300-ton ship. But Horn is not planning to stay. The brigantine is fast. That is its singular advantage, and Horn understands it with the clarity of a man who has built his entire career around doing the one thing available to him better than anyone else could do it. The Saint's Lament comes in at speed. Not a cautious approach, not a careful positioning, but a full sail run across the creature's body at close range. And as it passes, Horn's crew throws every lit torch, every heated tar pot, every piece of burning material they have been able to prepare in the 4 minutes since they saw what was happening, directly onto the exposed surface of the mantle. The tar catches. It does not catch everywhere. It does not catch dramatically. Not at first. The surface of a giant squid is wet, cold, covered in the mucus of the deep ocean, and open fire applied to wet, cold mucus produces a more tentative result than fire applied to dry timber. But pine tar burns with a persistence that wetness cannot fully extinguish. It clings, it continues, and the surface of a giant squid, for all its remarkable biological properties, has no particular resistance to sustained combustion. The chromatophores that shift the color of its skin in the deep ocean do not have a setting for this. The creature's response to fire is immediate and comprehensible in a way that its previous movements were not. It pulls back, not a recoil, a pull, a full body retraction of the mantle below the surface, the arms following, the grip on the perdition's compass rail releasing as the biological imperative of removing itself from the burning stimulus overrides whatever else was occupying its attention. The ship lurches back to level, but this is not victory. It is a pause. The creature is still there, below the surface 30 feet down, maybe 40, visible as a darkness moving in the water. The ink it has released forming a cloud that the late afternoon light filters through in ways that produce shadows in shapes that none of the men watching from the deck can look at comfortably. The tentacles are still moving. The arms are still extended. It has not left. It has simply changed the terms. Karen understands in this pause what the next stage of the engagement requires. He needs to keep the creature on the surface. The moment it submerges fully, the moment the darkness in the water closes over itself and the arms are out of reach of any fire or shot or tar, the engagement ends on the creature's terms, not his. A submerged giant squid at depth is inaccessible. It is patient. It can wait for the ships to be becalmed, to lose the wind, to drift into range of whatever approach it decides to take next. He cannot fight what he cannot reach. He needs it on the surface, and the tar brought it to the surface, and the tar is therefore the weapon. He needs more tar. He needs the absolution. The third ship, the converted fishing vessel, the smallest and least capable of the three, the one that has spent this entire engagement at a distance that Corin has been privately grateful for, because the absolution would not survive an arm on her rail for 30 seconds, has something that the other two ships do not. She carries 3 full barrels of whale oil. Whale oil is not pine tar. It is not identical in its combustion properties, but it is flammable, reliably, substantially, persistently flammable. and it is available in a quantity that neither of the other ships can match, because the Absolution was a whaling vessel before she was a pirate vessel, and she still carries the equipment and the supplies of her original occupation. She has harpoons too, which are going to matter in a moment. Karen signals to the Absolution's captain, a taciturn Basque named Arietta, who has said perhaps 400 words in the entire 6 months of their association, are simple. Come alongside to starboard. Bring the oil, bring the harpoons. Come now. Arietta comes, without visible hesitation, which is either courage or the specific form of professional focus that looks identical to courage from the outside. The approach he takes is not direct. He uses the Perdition's compass as cover, keeping the larger ship between himself and the creature in the water, until he is close enough that the transfer can happen quickly. The oil barrels come across on lines. The harpoons follow. 6 of them, the heavy iron-headed whaling harpoons that were designed to penetrate the blubber of a sperm whale and hold. And here is where the approach to fighting a Kraken, the best available approach, given the technology of 1721 and the specific circumstances of this engagement, reaches its most coherent and most dangerous form. You do not fight a Kraken from the ship. You cannot. The ship is too high, its weapons too fixed in their orientations, its capabilities too thoroughly organized around a different category of threat. The ship is a platform, not the weapon. The ship keeps you alive long enough to get close enough to apply the actual weapon. The actual weapon is fire, carried by men. In boats, 2 longboats go over the side of the Perdition's compass. Each carries 4 men, 2 of whom row and 2 of whom hold. One a harpoon line attached to a barrel of whale oil, the other a torch that has been burning since the tar pots came up from storage. The harpoon is not going to be thrown in the conventional sense. It is going to be driven, at close range, into whatever part of the creature is visible at the surface, and the line attached to it is going to be set burning, and the barrel at the end of the line is going to be pulled inward toward the point of contact. Fire, delivered to the interior. It is, to be honest, not a plan that any of the 8 men in the longboats are entirely comfortable with. It requires getting close enough to the arms to be within their reach. It requires staying close long enough to drive the harpoon home and set the line burning. It requires rowing back faster than the creature can respond. It requires, above everything else, the belief that the discomfort of fire is more immediately compelling to the creature than its interest in the ships. The first boat drives the harpoon in. The arm that takes hold of the boat does so with a speed that the 2 men not rowing do not have time to properly register before they are in the water. The boat itself is pulled under for a moment, the arm taking it, the wood crying out with the sound that only overloaded timber makes, before the torch, tumbling free in the chaos, lands on the oil-soaked harpoon line, and the line catches and the fire runs inward along it and reaches the contact point. The arm releases. The boat surfaces. 2 men are in the water. They are pulled back to the Perdition's compass by lines thrown from the deck, which Karen had ordered, thrown before the longboats went over the side, because Karen was, above everything else, a man who thought about what happened next. The second boat drives its harpoon before the creature can fully retract. The creature retracts anyway, fully this time. The darkness in the water deepens and then disperses and then is simply gone, and the water where it was is ordinary water again, cold and dark and deep and empty in the way that water is empty when it contains nothing but itself. It is gone, not killed, not defeated in any meaningful sense, not driven away permanently or taught a lesson or convinced that these 3 ships represent a category of thing it should avoid in the future. Simply gone. Return to the depth it came from, carrying with it the pain of the fire and the harpoon wounds and whatever calculations a creature of its neurology performs about cost and benefit and the relative merits of continuing an engagement that has become inconvenient. The sea around the 3 ships is flat and grey and silent. Karen stands at the rail of the Perdition's compass for a long time after it is gone. Long enough that his navigator eventually comes to stand beside him, and neither of them says anything for a while. 4 men lost, 2 in the water and pulled back, 2 simply gone. Taken in the initial engagement before anyone had a response organized, taken into the water from which things taken in that way do not return. The rail on the port side is destroyed. The planking below it, where the arm held, will need to be replaced before the ship is seaworthy in any serious weather. One of the stern chaser carriages shattered when the list came on suddenly and the gun lurched against its own mounting. He does not count this as a victory. He is too experienced to count this as a victory. Victory is when you impose your will on the situation. What happened today was something considerably more modest. He imposed his will on the situation long enough for the situation to lose interest in him. Those are not the same thing, but they are alive. The 3 ships are intact. The water is calm. The Faroe Islands are 4 days away and the wind is favorable, which it was not this morning. He turns from the rail and begins the work of organizing the repairs. In the water below, in the darkness that begins at 40 meters and deepens without end, something very large is moving. It is moving slowly. It is in no particular hurry. It has nowhere it needs to be.